Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Holly McKay. This time we are talking to Holly while she is in country in Ukraine. Holly, how are you doing over there?
I'm doing all right. Tired, but good.
There you go. Hey, so you've been there for how long now? What parts of the country have you
A
been
couple of
visiting?
weeks.
Okay.
My main focus really was just we spent a little bit of time in Kiev very briefly, just kind of getting the lay of the land and catching up on things, and then made a really long drive. So it was sort of a long trip in general because the way it works, obviously the airport's not open, so we had to fly from DC to through Frankfurt to Krakow. And then from there, it's sort of from Krakow, and the border is very arbitrary. Sometimes you can get through very breezily, other times people are waiting days, um, hours, especially on the other way back. But sort of getting in was a little bit quicker. But generally, that drive from Krakow in Poland down to Kiev, you're looking at about 12 to 14 hours. So it's a long drive after a long flight, but that's sort of the only way in, obviously, without functioning airports. You can also take the train, but that also has its own border complications too. And there's a bus. But we were lucky enough, sort of with a small group, to be in a vehicle and then sort of to make the drive into Kiev. And yeah, sort of from there, just kind of a bit of a day of meetings and catching up and picking up body armor and things like that. And then sort of my main focus on this trip being sort of a short trip, just a couple of weeks, was to really go to the east, which is obviously the heart of the battle, and to just sort of get a real sense of exactly what's happening, what is left, and sort of trying to bring that ground view um, back. Kyiv now, obviously, over this past sort of week, it did come under some bombardments and civilian areas were hit, which is very sad, and also in other parts of the country as well. But things have compared to when I was here back earlier this year, just sort of after the invasion and during the invasion, things are a lot more normal now in sense of businesses are open, restaurants are open. There is still a curfew, but the curfew is much later. Gosh, when I was here, I believe it was sort of 6 p.m. and now I think people can sort of stay out till 10 is the time that you can kind of stay out and then you have to be indoors. So yeah, so things are a lot sort of more normal in that sense. But going east, you're very much going back into a war zone. You're going back, sort of you. It's a rough journey because a lot of it is sort of rubbled road. Not as many checkpoints as I expected. I mean, I again at the beginning of the year is my frame of reference, and there were checkpoints everywhere. Here, a lot less, but still, as you go deeper into Donbas and toward Donetsk and the areas under Russian occupation, there certainly are checkpoints. But yeah, it was a very much, yeah, going again from the West Ukraine is a very different world now to going to the East. And there always was a lot of differences between them, but now it's sort of going into two different countries, really.
Yeah. Okay. So, this interesting because the Donbas Donetsk region is really where a lot of all this started. You know, count Crimea, but and in recent weeks, the Ukrainians have made strides in the south, but this is in the northeast of the country, and it sounds like the Russians are, holding on to the place and staying at least as much as they can because they've been there for a while. How what would you say are the conditions in that part of Ukraine at this time? Particularly now it's getting to be winter again.
Yeah, we had our first snowfall this week, first snowfall in the east as well as in Kiev and other places. So it's definitely the cold is setting in. So we sort of went through Dnipro and stayed at sort of it's kind of the last major city that's still relatively safe, if you will, Kramatorsk. But from Kramatorsk, well, that was sort of our base. And then each day we were traveling. So whilst a lot of the attention has been on Kherson over the past couple of weeks, the Ukrainians took it back and sort of different causes for celebration. I was with a friend of mine. His name is Andy Milburn, and he was a colonel in the Marines. He ran MARSOC divisions throughout Iraq, Afghanistan, many different special operations areas. And he started this group called the Mozart Group. And it's an NGO. They focus sort of on two components, one being training, the other being evacuation teams and into the areas where no one else is. So one of the teams went to Odessa for training, and then another team went to the evacuation team in the East. And so I went with the East team. And yeah, I mean, it was very eye-opening. And this is a group that's got 11 different nationalities. I met a Kiwi, there are Aussies, there are Brits, Americans, there are Israeli, there's a sort of a good sort of UN selection there. And they're all people that are usually all have very strong military backgrounds and sort of help. Again, it's definitely, it's not involved in fighting. It's not involved in anything directly combat related by any means. We don't even have, armored cars. But that was, they help in uh, the humanitarian side of things. And it was important for me to really get a sense of groups on the ground, because so often with war and things, people come to me and they want to be able to help and they don't know how to help. And sometimes it's really hard for me to make too many referrals of how people can help unless I've really seen the work that people do, because otherwise, you want to make sure your money is going to the right place if you are donating. So I sort of joined, I guess, and embedded with the Mozart group for this week. And I have to say, I was fairly fascinated by the work they were doing. And when I say literally nobody is in these areas, nobody, not even police, nobody is in these areas. The only things you'll see are a Ukrainian military tank going through ready, these are frontline areas. And I definitely experienced that myself. So we focused a lot on a evacuated city named Bakhmut. And it is sort of now where the Wagner Group is and where the focus of a lot of the attention since Russia's embarrassment from Kherson. So now that they're very focused on Bakhmut. And so that was sort of the area that we went through, with the main goal being looking at who was left. Obviously, most people have left the area, and we were looking at who was left. And the Mozart team was sort of looking at how they could offer assistance in evacuating people, welfare checks, bringing people humanitarian aid, all sort of things like that. And it was, I mean, it was an incredibly dismal scene. There are probably, I believe it was, a city that maybe had 70, 80,000 people before the war. There are still people left, very much sort of in hiding. I would say there's probably between 10 to 15,000 probably still there, if that, maybe less. And you've got east and west sides of it, and then you've got a completely blown up bridge of where the sides used to, be connected. Now it's very difficult moving from one to the other unless you have a fairly stable vehicle. But for multiple days that we were there, we came under pretty intense bombardment, much more than what my comfort level lacked. So it really brought home to me that these families are just sort of living with this. They're used to a howitzer missile landing 100 feet from them. They're used to that sound of of outgoing, and then knowing that 1 minute later there's going to be a whole bunch of incoming. So it's incredibly sort of, I think, terrifying experience. And anyone who tries to tell you that there's any kind of adrenaline that comes from that, I very much beg to differ. It's not a pleasant experience, but it certainly brought home to me just what these families are really having to endure, and also the danger that a lot of these American and Western volunteers are putting themselves in and day out. And it's such a game of luck, really. Just how, I'll give you one example. We were traveling, we met up with another people from the group in a van, and as we're all leaving the area one day, we said we're going to all meet up at this particular point, just on the outskirt of the city, travel together along the same road back to sort of our lodging. And then as we sort of getting there, we misplaced the van, which had been in front of us, and we lost them. And then 30 seconds later, you just hear that whistle and that couple of terrifying seconds of waiting for it to land, and it absolutely obliterated just very close where there was a fence. And that was the exact meeting point that the van would have been sitting at, waiting for us to get there, had they not got lost. So it definitely brings home what a real kind of game of luck it is. And especially working in a place like Bakhmut, and you're going through it, and you're seeing families. We met one family and there was a girl and she spoke beautiful English. She was about 12 or 13, looking after her two younger brothers, there with her family, sort of all refusing to leave. There's no power, no water, no electricity. Every single building is sort of blown apart. There are no windows, and you can imagine the cold. So these people are just kind of lighting fires. Um, they're trying to kind of stay warm and refusing to leave. And it's sort of each for their own different reasons. Generally, you find that it is older people that refuse to leave. But it did break my heart to kind of see a few different families of children that are sort of living there, and you just wonder how long they're willing to stay and how long that, until it all becomes too much. But the problem is, so many people, I think we overestimate that so many people don't necessarily have money or family. There's not really sort of the establishment of, a UN camp that you may see in another war zone. So for a lot of people, there just isn't anywhere to go. And there was another woman that we met, and she was probably in her late 50s, early 60s, and her house again completely blown apart, but she's still living in it. And she and her husband had actually left. They had evacuated, a week and a half earlier, I believe. And then they were told that they would get free rent, all these sort of services, and they realized, and they sort of got past the shelter and realized that wasn't the case, that there really wasn't that support system in place. They had to come back. 2 days later, their house was shelled. Her husband was badly wounded, so he's currently in hospital, and she's living there by herself. So it's just this sort of sad situation of nobody can be forced to leave, but the group really does go around and sort of encourage people that the risk of something happening to you by just continuing to stay here is too high. And beyond just the shelling, you're looking at, there are no services. You're getting colder by the day. um, what happens when you run out of gas, and that's another thing the group's doing. They're giving people gas and sort of trying to help, but that's only doable, I think, for so long. But yet, so many people are just sort of wanting to stay. There was another 93-year-old blind woman, and when the team went to sort of talk to her, and they go in and sort of check on her every week, I guess, and she says, "Why are you bothering me? I'm happy to die here." Um, and she's chopping wood, and she's can barely see, and so it's sort of an incredible sense of resilience. At the same time, um, it's sort of heartbreaking to see this happening.
Yeah. So, and these people now have to survive the coming of yet another European winter. Um, so, you know, in passing, the group on the Russian side that's there, that's the private army group that is operating
Yeah,
in that
so the
area.
Wagner is a PMC, and it's sort of, I guess it's Russia's sort of most notorious kind of PMC, and it's very known for its very brutal actions across the world, really. They're Syria, they're in the Central African Republic, they're sort of operate in these sort of shadowy war zones all around the world, and they have a very strong presence in the conflict here. But and again, their goals and areas of operation change, but they are currently, Bakhmut is sort of the area that Wagner, which is sort of a PMC, but very much an elite group, I think, are doing a large amount of the fighting there. And that's sort of where Russian military commanders kind of point people when they're desperate for a win or desperate to get some sort of attention. And with Andy and the Mozart group that was sort of founded, the name, obviously both being very famous composers. And so Mozart group was sort of named in counter of that. They're not a PMC, but that is sort of where the name sort of came from. And it definitely makes its way onto a lot of different propaganda channels. The Mozart group could have become quite well known in the Russian Telegram propaganda channels, and very much misconstrued as being some sort of military kind of group, which it's not. But it really does do important work. And again, this is no humanitarian group will go anywhere near these areas. I mean, nowhere near. And I even met a couple of lovely, women in Kiev from the European Advisory Board and other NGOs, and they just said that they're not allowed to go anywhere near any of these sort of danger zones. So, having groups like that go and do that is sort of very incredibly important, whether it is evacuation, whether it is delivering aid, whether it is just simply a welfare check. I mean, those things are incredibly dangerous work, and that sort of was brought home to me. And Another thing I really thought about is the sort of sense of of lawlessness that even happens in war, where there are just no services for anything else. And I'll give you one example. Where one of these houses we were at in West Bakhmut, there was sort of people living outside, and the women there, they had black eyes and broken noses. So there's obviously a lot of violence that kind of goes on in this area that I think is quite rough. And they said, "Oh, look, there's a dead body upstairs. Will you go and collect it?" It's been there for 9 days, and one thing that the group does is they do collect dead bodies, but generally it's more from people that have died of natural causes, an old man that may have fallen in his house and not been able to get any help, or things like that, because again, there are no services in these places. And so we went upstairs, and as we go into the room, these cats, run out. The cats had obviously been eating the body, not to be too graphic. It was an old man, and his face had been completely hacked off, and he's just lying there, and he'd been dead for 9 days, and the cats are eating him. And it's obviously a violent scene had happened. When I talked to the people living there, they just sort of dismissed it and pretended they didn't really know. It seems to me that they'd gotten drunk and got into a fight, and he'd been killed by someone else there. We went to the police station. Again, you're under this heavy shelling, you're in a police station. Police wouldn't even let us in. We're at the gate trying to talk to them. And they just said, we're not going there. I'll tell my commander, we'll make a report, but we're not going there. And that just sort of brings home, I think, just, what you can get away with, I guess, during a wartime, and just that there isn't even anyone to go and collect a dead body. Nobody, for safety reasons, is going to go in there. It's also very unclear who was left there and how many of them are Russian sympathizers, and therefore, how potentially unsafe that would be for Ukrainian police to even go there anyway. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure, several days later, that body is still there. So it's just sort of this bizarre black hole that we often don't think about. When we think about war, we think about all the immediate things, but we don't think about all the other things that we would normally rely on in our day-to-day life. Trash is everywhere. There's no water, no electricity, no school, certainly just, and for anyone that's left there, it's very baffling how you can survive. But certainly a number of people that are left there, I think a significant number of them would be Russian sympathizers. For example, there was one store that was shelled, and it was completely, just sort of, not completely, but very much destroyed, and everything around it. 2 days later, it reopened again, and we went in there to buy some energy drinks. There was nowhere else to go, and they, the store owner said the Ukrainians are shelling us. And it's sort of like, do you have any concept? Ukrainians are here. The incoming is coming from the Russian side, but to them, this was, they were being shelled by the Ukrainians. And it saddens me to hear that narrative also being repeated in the West. And every time I post a picture or mention Ukraine, usually the first onslaught of comments, whether they're Russian bots or not, or people that I know with, military backgrounds, whatever it may be, start to come at me with this sort of propaganda about Ukrainian being corruption. Yes, we know Ukraine is a corrupt country. It certainly has imperfections, and they certainly need to be addressed. But now, it's wartime right now. So sort of trying to paint Ukraine in some ways the aggressor. And when I'm hearing that, particularly come from the West, it just sort of blows my mind how far down the misinformation track we've gotten. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that is a subject for another time and another chat. But for now, Hollie McKay reporting from Ukraine with some very fresh and very unique on-the-ground information. Thanks, Hollie. And we'll talk to you again soon.
We'll talk soon. Thank you, Dennis.
All right.